You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music. In 2012, a teenager in Minnesota opened her eyes from a deep sleep. One of the last things she remembered was feeling sick at a volleyball practice. Now she saw that she was lying in a bed in a small, crowded room. She heard piercing tones and beeps coming from something on her right side. She tried to sit up and realized that she could barely move. In fact, it took all of her strength just to lift her head and look down toward her feet. She was shocked at what she saw. Narrow plastic tubes and white wires were piled like spaghetti all around her. As she moved, she felt a pulling sensation, and she realized that all these tubes and wires were attached to her body. And then she saw that they all led to one place, a massive machine the size of a refrigerator sitting on the right side of her bed. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw someone come into the room. It was her mother, and her eyes were filled with tears. She took her daughter's hand and explained that the giant machine to the right of her was breathing for her. It was keeping her alive, and she might need it for the rest of her life. From Ballin Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballin, and this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape: our own bodies. If you like today's story, the next time the follow button is asleep, please decorate their car papier-mâché style. This episode is called Breathless. It was the first day of school in September of 2012, and a 16-year-old girl named Emma stood at her locker in the tiny town of Thief River Falls, Minnesota. She had volleyball practice next, so she threw a water bottle, a deodorant stick, hair ties, and a few other items into her backpack. Emma was excited that summer was over and they were back in school, but really just because she was excited about sports, not so much for her classes. She had made the varsity volleyball team, and now she was anxious to get on the court with her teammates. Emma looked in the tiny mirror mounted on the inside of her locker door, and immediately she grimaced at her reflection. She touched up her eyeliner and pulled her hair back into a tight ponytail. Her acne was flaring up again, even though she was taking medication for it, so she put on some concealer to cover it up. Then she threw the makeup into her backpack and shut her locker. A few minutes later, Emma walked into the noisy school gymnasium and dropped her backpack behind the bleachers. She could hear the familiar squeaking of sneakers and the smacking of volleyballs as her friends warmed up for practice. Emma felt right at home as she ran out to join them. But about halfway through the practice, Emma began to feel really tired. And not the normal kind of tired from like working out or running around. Her feet felt really heavy and her heart was pounding. When she looked around, she saw her teammates did not seem tired, so Emma just pushed herself and continued running all the drills. But after a few more minutes, she felt so winded that she just had to stop. And so her teammates rushed past her as Emma knelt down on one knee to catch her breath. Emma was used to feeling very fit and strong, but now her chest felt tight and she could barely breathe. She staggered to her feet and stumbled over to the bleachers. Emma's head felt heavy as she held it in her hands. She felt a sharp pain in her throat every time she swallowed, and now she was starting to feel scared. Her coach walked over and asked Emma if she was okay. Emma silently shook her head no. Her coach placed the back of her hand on Emma's forehead, and she told Emma she was burning up and suggested she go home and rest. Emma nodded and then stood and slowly shuffled around the bleachers to pick up her backpack. She dug out her phone from inside and then called her mom and then told her she wasn't feeling good and needed to come home early. When Emma's mother arrived, she felt her daughter's forehead and saw she was burning up, so she drove Emma right to their family doctor. The doctor took Emma's vitals and discovered she definitely had a fever, with a temperature of 103 degrees Fahrenheit. So she was sick for sure. He tested to see if Emma had strep throat, a common illness among teenagers, but the test was negative. After reviewing her charts for a few minutes, The doctor explained to Emma and her mother that Emma probably had a fast-moving viral infection. He told her to go home and rest and that her symptoms should clear up in a couple of days. Emma was glad to hear that it wasn't anything serious. She didn't want to miss a lot of volleyball practices. But when Emma woke up the next day, she felt more tired than she ever had in her whole life. It was like her limbs just didn't want to move, and her lungs could barely take in any air. Emma cried out for her parents, Janet and Martin, and a few seconds later they ran into Emma's room, and the second they saw how sick Emma looked, they told her, "We're going to the emergency room right now." During the 25-mile drive to the hospital, Emma struggled to breathe. By the time they finally arrived, Emma was gasping for air as hospital staff helped her out of the car and onto a gurney. As a nurse wheeled Emma into a room, her mother squeezed her hand and her father followed close behind. The nurse's soft voice was very comforting as she asked Emma questions, but Emma struggled to answer even simple ones like where did she go to high school. Emma vaguely felt the prick of a needle in the crook of her elbow as the nurse attached an IV and drew several vials of blood. Then the nurse placed an oxygen mask over Emma's nose and mouth and picked up a phone. Emma could hear the seriousness in the nurse's voice. She wondered if maybe this was just how nurses sounded in the ER, or maybe this was something really bad. A few minutes later, the nurse wheeled her gurney to a room down the hall and positioned a large X-ray machine over Emma's chest while she lay there. Emma knew that the X-rays could not actually hurt her, but as the machine began to click and hum, Emma really started to feel terrified. What was wrong with her? When the nurse wheeled Emma back to her room after the X-ray, she turned down the harsh overhead lights and told Emma to rest while they waited for the results. Emma was grateful for the peace and quiet. She closed her eyes and immediately sank into a deep sleep. An hour later, Emma was startled awake as a doctor wheeled in a computer and dimmed the overhead lights, pulling up a digital image of her chest. Janet and Martin, Emma's parents, stood up from their chairs in the corner of the room as the doctor began to point to all these dark, cloudy spots on the image. The doctor told Emma and her parents that the grayish cloud on her lungs indicated a severe case of pneumonia. The doctor explained that they could treat the pneumonia with drugs, but the big question was what caused Emma's lungs to become so infected. It could be a bacteria, a virus, a fungus, or something else. Hopefully more tests would help them figure it out. But the doctor said that this small regional hospital was not equipped to run those type of tests. He was arranging for Emma to be transferred to the Sanford Medical Center in Fargo, North Dakota, almost 100 miles away. It was the closest hospital with a pediatric intensive care unit. Emma grabbed onto her mother's hand as an orderly came to wheel her into another ambulance. Volleyball practice suddenly seemed very far away. About 2 hours later, a physician at Sanford Medical named Dr. Sherry Richards rushed down the busy hall in the pediatric ICU and into Emma's room. Emma's mom sat next to her sleeping daughter, brushing hair out of Emma's face, while her father sat in the corner, anxiously bouncing his leg. Dr. Richards introduced herself to the parents and then walked up to examine Emma. And right away, she noticed Emma had very shallow breathing and bluish lips and fingertips, and then she gently touched Emma's hand and it was cold. These were all symptoms of Emma's pneumonia. Dr. Richards smiled at Janet and Martin and told them she was going to prescribe powerful antibiotics to suppress the infection in Emma's lungs. Now, she wasn't sure exactly what was causing the infection, but these antibiotics covered a broad spectrum of disease-causing agents, so hopefully the drugs would help Emma start to feel better, while Dr. Richards continued to look for more specific answers. But the next morning, less than 48 hours after Emma initially felt ill, her condition only seemed to be getting worse. She had an extremely high fever, and her breathing was shallow and rapid, and so very little oxygen was reaching her bloodstream. Dr. Richards needed to do something drastic. She asked Emma's parents for permission to place Emma on a ventilator, a machine that forces air into the lungs when someone is struggling to breathe. Emma would need to have a tube inserted through her windpipe so enough air and oxygen could reach her lungs. Her parents hated the idea, but watching Emma gulping for air, they told the doctor to do whatever it took to help their daughter. Dr. Richards checked in on Emma every day, hoping that with more oxygen, Emma's lungs would get better. But even with the help of the ventilator, Emma wasn't recovering. Emma's heart and other organs were not getting enough oxygen to function properly. Dr. Richards was perplexed. She said to a nurse how incredibly rare it was for a young, athletic high school student to be put on a ventilator. Sudden respiratory failure like this did not just happen out of the blue. The most likely cause for what was happening to Emma would be some kind of viral or bacterial infection, but Dr. Richards thought that was unlikely for one simple reason. None of her schoolmates were getting sick. It was just Emma. So Dr. Richards took a closer look into Emma's patient history to see if there was anything about her on an individual level that could spark any clues. By all accounts, she seemed like your average teenage girl whose only regular medication was a very common acne treatment, meaning it was extremely unlikely that Emma's current condition was caused by a rare side effect from this acne treatment. Also, Emma did not have any relevant allergies either. So, to cover all her bases, Dr. Richards ordered a wide range of tests. She wondered if maybe the respiratory issues were caused by a blood clot in Emma's lungs, or maybe she had undiagnosed rheumatoid arthritis that scarred her lungs. But every test Dr. Richards ran on Emma just came back negative. Dr. Richards was totally stumped. And so she suspected that whatever was happening to Emma had to be extremely rare. It was so uncommon she couldn't find any existing records of similar cases anywhere, which also meant she couldn't find a way to treat it. It quickly became obvious that the ventilator was not enough to stabilize Emma's breathing. After a few days, Dr. Richards switched her to a more powerful ventilator that pumped even more air into her lungs, but even that was still not enough. There was only one option left, a very powerful machine that is normally reserved for patients on the brink of death. A team from the famed Mayo Clinic flew to Fargo with a high-tech, refrigerator-sized device known as an ECMO machine. All the blood in Emma's body would now circulate through this ECMO machine, which essentially takes over the job of her heart and lungs. The ECMO machine required surgery to insert all the thin plastic tubes into Emma's body, and her mother immediately gave permission to do this surgery, knowing this could be Emma's only hope. As soon as Emma's surgery was done and she was successfully hooked up to the ECMO machine, Dr. Richards arranged to fly her back to the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. There, Emma would be under the care of specialists who had experience treating patients who were as critically ill as Emma was. But this also meant she would now be 400 miles away from her home. As Dr. Richards watched the team roll Emma and the giant ECMO machine toward the airplane, she shook her head at the danger her young patient now faced. She was convinced that Emma's heart, lungs, and kidneys were so damaged that they would never function again without the help of this machine. Now, Emma's only hope of getting off the ECMO machine was to get new organs. But the wait for a 3-organ transplant could take months that she might not have. For now, the ECMO was saving Emma's life, but there was a catch. The longer she had to wait for new organs, the greater risk that she would die. Once Emma was settled in at the Mayo Clinic, her new doctor explained the situation to her. She was at the top of the priority list to receive her new organs, but there was no telling how long that might take. Emma fought to keep her emotions under control. In just a few short weeks, she'd gone from the varsity volleyball team to needing a machine to stay alive. It was almost overwhelming to process. But Emma refused to lay back and mope. She was determined to regain control of something in her life. So she told her doctor she wanted to walk. She saw the doctor look at her with amazement. He encouraged her to go for it, but he also gently told Emma that given her condition, he wasn't sure that she could even muster the energy to stand, let alone take a step. And even if she could, she'd have to drag along this massive ECMO machine and all the tubes and monitors that came with it. But as an athlete, Emma was familiar with the importance of a good attitude. She knew she was physically weak, but she was also very determined. With enough time and effort, she was certain she could eventually walk on her own. So Emma asked some nurses to help her sit up and place her feet on the floor. She was so dizzy that her head spun, and she had to lie down again almost immediately. But Emma refused to give up. She tried again the next day and sat on the edge of the bed a little longer. And the next day, she sat for even longer. Eventually, Emma was strong enough that she was able to actually stand up, albeit she had to hold on to her mom for support. And then it wasn't long after that Emma was straight up walking out of her room and standing in the hall without her parents' help. Finally, Emma managed to make it all the way down the 60-foot-long corridor to the hospital chapel. And there, Emma tasted her first solid food since she'd been hooked up to the ECMO machine. It was just a communion wafer, but Emma could not believe how good that dry, stale cracker tasted. One morning, after more than 6 months at the Mayo Clinic, Emma's doctor came into her room to review the latest readout from her ECMO machine. As he walked over to it, he smiled down at Emma, who was in bed tapping on her phone. The doctor felt so bad for Emma because she was in this impossible situation, but he was also very proud of Emma for really handling this situation with grace. She was so optimistic and so positive, even though most people would be totally devastated and depressed. The doctor looked at the numbers from the ECMO machine and had to do a double take. He wondered if he was actually misreading the data. Emma looked up from her phone and asked him what was going on, and Emma's doctor told her that her blood pressure, heart rate, and blood oxygen levels all seemed to be improving. He had no explanation for why this was happening, but given the numbers he was seeing, Emma's organs might have recovered enough to function without the help of the ECMO. Doctors still had no idea what had made Emma sick in the first place, but almost miraculously, she appeared to be getting over it. After more than 6 months on the ECMO machine, the tubes in Emma's body were finally removed and she was officially disconnected from the machine. She never got a transplant because she didn't need one. Her organs had mysteriously recovered all on their own. Finally, on a spring day in 2013, Emma left the hospital for good. She had been in the hospital for a total of 7 months with a mystery disease that had baffled some of the best doctors in the world. Now, Emma could return to normal life as an active teenager. But a dark shadow hung over Emma. The doctors had never figured out what was making her sick. So what was to stop it from striking her again, or somebody else in the future? 2 years later, Emma and her parents returned to the Mayo Clinic for a checkup. She'd been coming every 6 months since being discharged, and so far there were no lingering issues from her mystery disease. Emma cheerfully greeted the medical staff as a nurse led her down the hospital's halls into an exam room. While the nurse took Emma's vitals, she remarked how happy all the staff was that Emma had made this full recovery, but then the nurse's face grew serious. The nurse told Emma that there was actually a 12-year-old girl at the hospital currently being treated for the same bizarre symptoms that Emma had experienced. Her lungs had stopped working and nobody knew why, and just like Emma had been, this 12-year-old was currently hooked up to an ECMO machine while awaiting an organ transplant. Emma was shocked to hear this. She held back tears as the memories of her own time on the ECMO machine came flooding back to her. She wanted to do everything she could to help this girl, and so Emma asked if maybe she could meet with the girl's parents. And sure enough, a couple of hours later, Emma and her parents sat down with the 12-year-old girl's parents in the hospital cafeteria. And over some hot coffee, they compared their respective histories. At first, the two girls' cases didn't seem to actually have that much in common. But then Emma remarked that she hoped this other girl at least didn't have the same skin problems that she, Emma, had dealt with when she was younger. The girl's mom laughed and said that her daughter had acne, but not any worse than any other teenager. The mother said that she was taking some medication for it, but it was an extremely common medication. It would turn out that both this girl and Emma were taking the same acne medication, called Bactrim, also known generically as TMP-SMX. The families would shake hands and go their separate ways, and then unfortunately, the 12-year-old girl would eventually die from the mystery condition. 3 years later, in March of 2018, Emma, who was now 21 years old, sat at her desk in her modest one-bedroom apartment, drinking her morning coffee and reading the news on her laptop. She clicked on a headline and her jaw dropped. She could not believe what she was seeing. It was a story about a 16-year-old high school student in Wichita, Kansas, named Z Uwadya. She was an athlete who played on several sports teams, but then her lungs just suddenly stopped working, and now Z was relying on an ECMO machine to survive. Emma couldn't believe the similarities between Z's story and her own. It made Emma also think back to that little 12-year-old girl who died a couple years back. Since then, Emma had heard about another teenager experiencing the same thing, and she too had also taken Bactrim, or TMP-SMX. Emma wondered if maybe Z, this person in this headline, was taking Bactrim as well. For years now, this suspicion about Bactrim had lingered in the back of Emma's mind, and now she was more certain than ever that this common medication was what had made them all so sick. Emma found an email address for the doctor who was treating Z, and she wrote to her immediately. Dr. Jenna Miller, who was caring for Z at Children's Mercy Hospital in Kansas City, Missouri, was catching up on paperwork when her inbox pinged. There was a message from a woman named Emma who said that she'd experienced something similar to Z, and she wanted to know if Z had taken Bactrim, because Emma had taken Bactrim, and so maybe that was a commonality. On one level, Dr. Miller thought it was highly unlikely that such a common drug could cause such a horrific reaction. Bactrim, or TMP-SMX, is the 6th most prescribed antibiotic in the entire United States. It's used to treat many different conditions. Then she remembered something. She scoured Z's files to confirm it. For several weeks before Z was admitted to the hospital, she had been suffering from a urinary tract infection. And the antibiotic that she was taking to treat it was Bactrim. Dr. Miller wrote back to Emma and told her that she very well might have just solved the mystery behind Z's condition and Emma's own horrible illness. It turned out all the girls with this mystery illness had taken Bactrim, TMP-SMX, shortly before being hospitalized. And when the doctors examined images of the girls' lung tissue samples, they discovered that they had all suffered the same kind of tissue damage. For some reason, the Bactrim was systematically destroying the cells responsible for breathing. Over the next 4 years, Dr. Miller searched patient records across the country for people who'd suffered inexplicable respiratory failure shortly after taking this drug. They identified 19 other cases, mostly young men and women under the age of 20. 6 had died, including Z Uwadya. No one knows why the antibiotic sometimes triggers this rare lung destruction, but Dr. Miller and her colleagues suspect that in rare cases, people's bodies have a potentially deadly allergic reaction to the drug. Today, Bactrim, or TMP-SMX, is still widely prescribed, but acute lung failure is now listed as a potential side effect. Emma is now 26 years old, and she works as a nurse who cares for patients who've just had heart and lung transplants. Emma knows that because of her reaction to Bactrim, which caused all this damage in her body, she can never be a serious athlete again. She gets winded after climbing a couple flights of stairs. But considering that she very nearly died, she doesn't mind at all.
Charles Holden was on his way home from work when he decided to stop at a fast food restaurant near his house in Harrington, Delaware. After grabbing a quick bite to eat, Charles left the store and got back in his truck. He turned it on and he was about to drive out of the lot when he stopped because there was this man running towards him, waving, trying to flag him down. So Charles put his truck back in park and he rolled his window down to see what this guy wanted. And when this stranger got close enough, he told Charles that his sister was having a baby and he needed a ride to the hospital, which was about 20 minutes away. Charles couldn't tell if this guy was lying. It was super late. He didn't know this guy and he just had a bad feeling about him. And so he told him, "No, I'm sorry. It's too late. I gotta get home. It's too far out of the way." The stranger immediately looked dejected and turned around and started walking away. And as Charles was watching him go, he felt bad and said, "You know what? Hey, come back here. I'll give you a ride part of the way there." And so the stranger smiled, hopped in his passenger seat, and they took off. Charles drove him approximately 3 miles in the direction he had asked to go before pulling over on the side of the road and telling him, "This is as far as I'm going to take you." Charles lived only about a block away, and he didn't want to drive too far away from home so late at night. But the stranger, upon hearing he was being let out so soon, suddenly became angry and began fumbling in his pocket like he was going to get a knife or some sort of weapon, and he starts screaming at Charles, "Hand over your keys, hand over your wallet, or I'm going to kill you." Charles, meanwhile, was on edge just being in the car with this guy because he had a bad feeling about him, and so he immediately jumped into action. He turned off his truck, he ripped the keys out of the ignition, and he leapt out of his truck and started running. Charles saw way off in the distance was a convenience store, and he figured he could run to there and get some help. But as he's running, he turns around and sees the stranger has also leapt out of the car and was now sprinting up to him with a screwdriver in his hand. And this stranger was running really fast. He was gaining on Charles, and soon Charles realized he wasn't going to make it to the convenience store before this guy caught up to him. And so at some point, Charles just stops, he turns around and he puts his hands up and he says, okay, I'll give you a ride wherever you want to go, and then you can have my keys, my wallet, you can have anything you want. And so the stranger runs right up to Charles and he stops and he smiles because he's very pleased with this result. And he pokes him with the screwdriver and kind of gestures for him to go back to the truck. So Charles walks back to the truck with the stranger right behind him with the screwdriver periodically poking him in the back. They finally get to the vehicle and the stranger tells Charles to get in the car and then wait. But as soon as Charles sat down, he fired up his truck and sped off before the stranger could hop in the passenger side door. And so Charles is flying away from this guy. He looks in his rear view mirror and he can see the guy is chasing after him with a screwdriver held over his head, but he sees the stranger at some point just stops, turns around, and walks away. Charles was totally relieved that he had escaped this horrible encounter, and he was thinking about calling the police, but ultimately decided he wouldn't because it was his decision to allow some stranger to get in his car in the middle of the night. And so Charles kind of blamed himself for the whole ordeal. What Charles was concerned about, though, was where he had ditched the stranger was not far from his house, and he was worried if he just turned around and drove right back to his house that this guy could recognize the truck and then follow him to his house, and then who knows what could happen. And so Charles decides he's just going to stay outside of town and drive around for a while to make sure this stranger is long gone by the time he comes back. So after about an hour of doing just that, driving around outside of town, Charles goes back into Harrington, Delaware, and he gets on his street, and he's shocked when he sees the stranger who had just tried to kill him is walking down the road right in front of him. But luckily, the stranger did not hear or see Charles pull onto his street, and so Charles immediately throws it in reverse and he gets out of there and he drives off. At this point, Charles decides he needs to tell police because he doesn't know if this stranger actually knows him and that maybe he's targeting him and he's waiting for him at his property. And so he calls 911 and he tells the dispatcher about what had happened earlier and how this guy is now lurking around his property. And the dispatcher tells him they'll send an officer out to him. And so a few minutes later, an officer showed up at the payphone where Charles was, and they told Charles they would escort him back to his property, and if this stranger was still out in the area, they would arrest him. And so the two of them made their way back to Charles's property. They get there, the stranger's long gone, and then Charles goes into his house. There's no sign of a break-in. There's no sign that anyone was near his property. And so Charles thanks the officer. He feels totally relieved. But before the officer leaves, he asks him if he wouldn't mind doing a quick sweep of his mother's property. She lived right behind Charles on the other side of some bushes. He told the officer her name was Dorothy. She was 70 years old and she lived alone. And he just wanted to make sure nothing happened to her. So the officer said, no problem, I'll go check in on her. So the officer leaves Charles and goes across his backyard through those bushes into Dorothy's backyard. And right away, he can see the back window on the back door has been smashed and the door itself is slightly ajar. And so the officer draws their pistol and they go up and they enter the house and they look inside. They're yelling for Dorothy, but there's no answer. It's totally dark in the house. It's totally silent. And so after searching the first floor and finding nothing, they make their way up the flight of stairs and they find blood at the top of the landing. And they follow this trail of blood and it brings them into one of the bedrooms where a woman is sprawled out on a bed. It was Dorothy. She had been stabbed to death. It would turn out, after Charles had ditched the stranger and sped off without him, the stranger, whose name was Gilbert Cannon, began looking for a place to sleep, and the house he ultimately selected just happened to be Charles's mother's house. After Gilbert broke in through her back door, he saw Dorothy coming down the steps to confront him, and because he was worried she'd be able to identify him, he attacked her with a screwdriver. Gilbert would later tell police that the attack on Charles was completely random. He was just at this fast food restaurant, he saw Charles get into his truck, and he thought to himself, if I can get in that guy's truck, I bet I can rob him. And then after this failed robbery, when Gilbert is out looking for a place to sleep and he breaks into this house and this woman comes down the stairs that he attacks and kills, he has no idea that this woman, Dorothy, is Charles's mother. The entire night was one big horrible coincidence. Gilbert would plead guilty to the murder and would be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In 1949, 15-year-old problem child Ken Rex McElroy dropped out of school and moved to a tiny farming town called Skidmore, Missouri. There, he began his life of crime, which consisted primarily of theft. At night, he would drive his truck onto Skidmore residents' property, and he would steal their livestock, alcohol, grain, food, antiques, anything he could get his hands on and that he could sell, he would take. And if the owners ever caught him in the act, he would just raise his rifle at them and tell them to go back inside and never report it to the police or he would kill them. And because Rex was this big 270-pound monster of a man who was known for having a bad temper and for being really aggressive, people generally just did what he asked and his crimes went totally unreported. In the rare instances that victims would report Rex's crimes to police, Rex would begin intimidating them and their family by staking out their houses at all hours of the night, or he would just walk directly up to these victims and he would say, "I will kill you if you testify against me." And if none of those tactics worked, Rex used some of his illegal money to hire one of the very best defense lawyers in the entire state, a lawyer who had famously represented the mob, and he would step in and get Rex off of virtually any charge, including the time Rex actually did shoot one of the owners who caught him in the act. Over the years, Rex would use these fear and intimidation tactics not just to make money, but also to prey on young women and girls. In the 1970s, when Rex was in his 40s, he began stalking a local Skidmore girl who was 12 years old named Trina. After assaulting her dozens of times, Rex learned her family was going to be pressing charges against him. So Rex burned down Trina's family's house and killed the family dog, and then threatened to kill the entire family unless they signed paperwork that would legally marry their daughter Trina to Rex. This would protect him legally in case they pressed any charges against him. After the family finally relented and signed off on the marriage, Trina was forced to come live with Rex at his house, and within 2 years, she became pregnant. After the birth of her child, she took her baby and tried to run away from Rex, and she ran back to her family's new house, and she was hiding there, but Rex tracked her down. He took her and their baby back, and then Rex proceeded to burn her family's house down again, and again killed their new family dog. By the end of the 1970s, Rex wasn't only just the most hated person in Skidmore, he was the most destructive person. He had hurt so many people in town, but it seemed like no one could do anything about it. It was like he was untouchable. Then a single piece of candy changed everything. In 1980, one of Rex's children was at a local grocery store in Skidmore when they were caught stealing a piece of candy. When the shopkeeper asked the child to put the candy back, they refused, and it caused this huge fight, and before long, Rex has found out about this huge fight, and Rex, instead of being upset with his child for stealing, he becomes enraged that the shopkeeper had the audacity to accuse his child of a crime. And so Rex began stalking the owner of the store, a 70-year-old man named Bo, along with the rest of Bo's family. At all hours of the night, Rex would just show up in front of their house with a gun slung across his lap, and he would fire shots into the air, and then during the day, he would walk right up to Bo and he would tell him, "I'm going to kill you." And so Bo and his family knew it was only a matter of time before Rex did become violent, and they were right. In July of that year, Rex showed up at Bo's grocery store with a shotgun in hand, and Bo, who was in the back of the shop loading groceries through the back door, he turns around and he sees Rex walking up to him. They have this heated confrontation where at some point Rex just raises a shotgun and he fires a shot into Bo's neck. Bo was gravely wounded, but he would survive, and Rex would actually get arrested and would be charged with attempted murder. And it seemed like, for once, maybe Rex was actually going to get what was coming to him, but he didn't. The attempted murder charge was lowered to just assault, and he was given 2 years in prison. But he would only serve 1 day in jail before being released on bond. And as soon as he was out on bond, he went right to his house and he got his rifle that had a bayonet attached at the end of it, and he went right to the tavern in the middle of Skidmore, and he began telling anybody who would listen that he planned to finish the job, i.e. he was going to kill Bo, and he described in very graphic detail how he planned to do it, which involved this rifle and this bayonet. Patrons that were at the tavern that saw Rex and heard these claims, they were scared for Bo, and so they left the tavern and they told city leaders about these threats. And so city leaders at this point, they've had enough of Rex, and they decide they're going to host this secret meeting that will not include Rex the following morning. So the next morning comes around and all these angry residents, they come to this meeting and they begin discussing, how are we going to handle Rex? We can't use police. We can't use politicians. Nothing can be done. So what are we going to do? How are we going to put an end to his reign of terror? And after a while, they came up with a plan. And after the meeting was done, everybody left the town hall, they got their guns, and they made their way over to the tavern where Rex was seen earlier that morning. About 40 of these armed men surrounded the outside of this tavern, and once they were all in place, another smaller group of men that were all armed walked inside the tavern, and they saw Rex sitting at the bar with Trina sitting right next to him. And so these men, they walk up right behind Rex, uncomfortably close, right behind him, and they just stand there with their guns looking at him. And at some point, Rex turns around and sees them, and he's about to lash out and start fighting them, but he realizes he's totally outnumbered, and these men that are standing all around him, they look like they mean business. And so he stands up, he grabs Trina, and he brushes past them, trying to act tough, and he walks out of the tavern. When he gets outside, he's taken aback at this additional group of armed men, which is much larger, who are all standing there just looking in at him. And so Rex at this point becomes visibly frightened, but he grabs Trina and he calmly walks out to his truck, which is parked a little ways out in front of the tavern. He gets in the driver's side, she hops in the passenger side, and Rex lights a cigarette up, he turns on his truck, and he's about to try to drive away when a gunshot rings out, and Rex immediately slumps forward onto his wheel. One of the Skidmore residents runs up to the truck, they open up the passenger side, and they grab Trina, who was unhurt, pulled her out, and rushed her to safety. Once she was clear, the other residents with their guns just moved in on the truck, and for 20 seconds they opened fire on Rex. After the shooting was over, nobody called an ambulance. Everyone just stood there and watched as the town bully died. In all, there were 46 witnesses that were there when Rex was murdered, but they all said they had either not seen the shooting or they didn't know who the shooter was. And despite a lengthy federal investigation, none of the witnesses ever changed their stories. And so as a result, no one was ever charged with Rex's murder. Years later, a Skidmore resident, when asked what happened here, they just said, that man needed a killing. On the morning of March 18th, 1990, a young woman named Karen parked her car just outside of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston, Massachusetts. This famous museum is home to over 15,000 pieces of priceless art from ancient Rome, medieval Europe, Renaissance Italy, Asia, the Islamic world, and 19th century France and America. The outside of this 4-story building is strikingly plain, but inside is strikingly gorgeous. There is this lush green open-air courtyard that sits right in the middle of the museum that all of the galleries look down into. Karen was an art enthusiast, and she was a security guard at this museum, and that day she was on duty. After parking her car, she got out and walked her way over to the employee entrance, and there she pressed the buzzer and announced her arrival to the 2 night shift guards that she would be relieving. But after a few seconds, the night shift guards did not respond to her, and they did not unlock the door. And so after a little while, Karen pressed the buzzer again and said, "I'm here, can you please open the door?" But again, the guards that were on duty did not respond back to her, and the door did not open. This was highly unusual, so Karen left the door, found a payphone, and called the chief of security for the museum, who lived out in town, and told him she couldn't get in the building. And so about 10 minutes later, the chief of security shows up, and he takes Karen, and he walks her around to the other side of the building. He leads her up an outdoor flight of stairs to another entrance to the museum. He pulls out a big ring of keys, he finds the right one, and he opens the door. The entrance they were going through placed them in this dark hallway that stretched out straight in front of them, and then at the very end of the hallway on the right was this very brightly lit room that the door was wide open to, and that was the security office where the guards were supposed to be. And so Karen and the chief, they begin walking down this hallway expecting to get to the end of it and look in.
O natuur, jouw hart zo groot, jij bent de ziel van fluistert zacht door de velden heen. De wolken dansen in de blauwe lucht. Het woud roept ons met zijn mysterie. De zonsondergang kleurt de horizon. Oh, natuur, jouw praat zo puur. In elke
inside this room and see these guards and get an explanation for why they didn't buzz Karen in the first place. But when they reach the end of the hallway and they look in this office, there's nobody inside of there. And now that they were up close, they could see the door leading into the security office had been smashed open. In fact, the doorknob to this door had been smashed off and was laying on the ground. And then next to it, right in front of them, was this metal crowbar. And then above them, the one camera that would have seen whatever had happened in the hallway, it had been turned around and was facing the wall. So Karen and the chief, they know they've stumbled on something that's probably really bad. They don't know what it is. They don't know if there's still people inside the museum. They don't know where the guards are. So the chief just grabs the crowbar for protection, and he and Karen run into the office and they call police. Although they didn't know it yet, Karen and the chief had just discovered one of the most famous crimes in history. The night before, 23-year-old security guard Rick Abath trudged his way down the walkway towards the employee entrance of the museum. He and another young man named Randy were scheduled to work the overnight shift that night. Rick hated his job at the museum because it was incredibly boring. But Rick didn't really have many other employment opportunities to choose from. He was a guy that had dropped out of music school and spent most of his time smoking marijuana, drinking beer, and playing in his friend's rock band. And so he just kept this job that he hated. Once Rick got inside the museum, he walked over to the office where he found his partner that night, Randy, was already sitting behind the desk. After chatting with him for a few minutes, Rick said he would do the first set of security rounds, and so he grabbed a walkie-talkie and a flashlight and he headed out to the exhibit halls. Almost immediately, a fire alarm went off. Rick went to the area where it was going off and he investigated and did not see a fire, and so he just turned the alarm off. The building was very old, and it wasn't uncommon for their electronics to fail or glitch. And so after this, Rick didn't think much of it. He continued doing his security rounds, and after about 30 more minutes of that, he made his way back down to the security office where he traded places with Randy. Rick took the seat behind the desk, and Randy took the walkie-talkie and flashlight and headed out into the exhibits. About 30 minutes later, while Randy was still doing his security rounds, Rick had his head down on the desk when he heard the sound of the buzzer coming from one of the outside doors. He lifted his head up and he looked at the screen that was connected to the camera, looking down at whoever was outside at this door, and he saw there were two police officers standing right outside the door. And so he reached over and he pressed the intercom button and he said, "Hey, can I help you?" And the officers said they were there responding to a disturbance call. Can they come inside? Now, Rick didn't know what this was about. He assumed it must have to do with maybe the fire alarm that had gone off earlier, or maybe somebody outside had seen someone trying to break in and they had called it in. But either way, he felt like it was important enough that he should let them in, even though it was against protocol to allow anyone into the museum after hours, including police. And so the two officers, they come through the doors and they wind up in the hallway right outside of the security office. And there's a window into the security office, so both the officers and Rick can see each other. And the officers immediately say to Rick, "Hey, are you working alone tonight?" And Rick says, "No, my partner is out doing security rounds. He'll be back soon." And so the officers just kind of nod their heads and they're looking around the room for a second. And one of them, as he glances at Rick again, he does kind of a double take and he goes, "Wait a minute, I think I know you. There's a warrant out for your arrest. You need to come out here and show me your ID." And so Rick is caught completely off guard, but he just kind of instinctively does what he's told because it's a police officer. And so Rick stands up, he walks out of the office, he goes out into the hallway, and as he's about to present his ID to the inquiring officer, the officer just grabs him, pushes him up against the wall, and handcuffs him. And so before Rick can say anything, Randy, his partner, comes back from doing his security rounds. He walks into the hall and has no idea what's going on. The other officer, the one that had not handcuffed Rick, grabs Randy and does the same thing, presses him up against the wall and handcuffs him. And so as Randy and Rick are standing there up against the wall with their hands behind their back, they're looking at each other, they're looking around thinking, what's going on here? And at some point, Randy just blurts out, "Why are we being arrested?" And that's when one of the officers just says, "Oh, you're not being arrested. You're being robbed." Rick and Randy were led by the imposter cops down into the basement of this building where they were bound and gagged with duct tape. And then these two thieves proceeded to spend the next 81 minutes walking all around the museum, ultimately stealing 13 pieces of art before destroying the security footage and then fleeing the building. Rick and Randy were discovered unhurt later that morning by police, still tied up in the basement. Despite dozens of suspects, numerous viable theories, and a massive monetary reward, these two art thieves were never caught and remain at large today. As for the 13 pieces of stolen art, one of which includes the extremely rare Rembrandt painting called The Storm on the Sea of Galilee, which is his only seascape in existence, they are still unaccounted for. And combined, they are worth a staggering $500 million. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments section what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to teach the like button how to drive in your car. And then on the day of their first lesson, show up in an 18-speed transmission semi-tractor trailer truck. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. If you want to get